We are speaking with Sune Sorensen. He is the founder of Librarium Associates, which is a global research facility focused on big macroeconomic and geopolitical trends serving institutional and private investors. We'll be talking about current geopolitical and macro trends. Thanks for coming on the Geopolitics and Empire podcast, Mr. Sorensen.
Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to speak with you today and looking forward to the conversation.
Now, before we discuss some of these trends, I'd like you to tell us about Librarium and the work that you do, because I only recently discovered it, but apparently you've been around for a couple of years. So can you tell us a bit more?
Absolutely. I mean, the Librarium format really sprung out of a number of different projects I was doing in the investment world. And it's kind of been the housing of my research, macro research mainly, work that I've done. And in the last 5-6 years, I want to say, we kind of expanded more into doing some regular publications, some kind of kept in-house and others we shared more broadly. And basically our approach is one of focusing on geopolitical trends, macroeconomics, really kind of a top-down approach. But instead of maybe focusing so much on data flows, which everyone knows can be sometimes misleading, I kind of like to take a more historic approach, lessons of history, look at more constant features like geography, look at things like demographic, which is more slow-moving trends, and then kind of look for how these mega trends that are kind of going around the world, let's say in technology, for example, perhaps changes some of the dynamics in those spaces.
I wanted to read a quote. So you sent me the publication and you quote the Napoleon that says, "The power of all nations are inherent in their geography." And that's funny because, when I started the Instagram account for Geopolitics and Empire, I decided to use it to make, use nice quotes and graphics. And that was the first quote that I used for the Instagram account. And then as well, you write that it has been our experience that real learning resides at the intersection of differing informed opinions expressed respectfully between learners. And this is funny because, again, this is also part of my philosophy, what I do with the podcast. And it's difficult to do that today because, when I speak to people from the left and then I'm called a communist, I speak to people, experts from the right, and then I'm called a right-wing extremist. Then I speak to people that don't fit a certain mold. And then, I'm told that I interview fringe nut jobs. And so it's really
people. Yeah, people like to put labels on things. I think that's an unfortunate way of doing things, as you say. I think that's also in our quote section. But again, from my life of traveling around, I think the world is no different than any other object in the sense that you can look at it from different areas and you will benefit from that. And obviously, you can do that through reading, you can do that through conversations, and I don't think putting labels on things is necessarily very helpful for that.
And so you just recently discussed a little bit about how you analyze these trends, and can you tell us just a little bit more? I mean, what makes you a little bit different? And because a lot of the traditional publications, what are some of the things you think that they get wrong? And then what are some better ways of analyzing the world?
Yeah, I don't really want to point fingers at anyone, but I do think that, I come from the financial industry. It's an industry that obviously has some science envy and where mathematics perhaps is overused, I think, because people see numbers and they think mathematics, they think certainty. And I think when you look at human complex systems, there is no such thing as certainty. And I think, you have to be a bit more humble in that sense, and maybe you have to look a bit broader. And I think there's something you can be learning from watching everyday life. There's something you can learn going all micro in and looking at business. There's things you can learn from looking at human psychology. There's things you can learn, I think, very much from history. And I think, again, once you sat and you look at all that, you kind of realize how little you really know. It's one of those things. And then I started saying, okay, let me build this up. I'm generally a curious person. I have always had an interest in history, geography. I love reading. So those are kind of some of my key tenets, and you kind of play a little bit to your strengths. I think you have to kind of get a framework together. And I have a basic curiosity. So I thought, okay, I was doing a lot of reading, a lot of sort of synthesizing that reading through thinking about what I read, trying to kind of ask questions about it and maybe, rethinking it. And then I found writing to be very useful because when let's say you're reading thousands of pages, you're taking in a lot of information, but what are you really doing with it? And I think the exercise of writing helps kind of focus the mind, and then obviously sharing that writing and getting feedback and maybe having some conversation where you spend more time listening than talking can be useful. So that's kind of like my raw approach, which I think maybe is not unique. I think it's quite straightforward, but I think maybe what I then started, the more you do this, the more you start searching to become more efficient with your work. And, that could go into the mundane of how you take notes, how you store your information, where you source your information. And obviously, ideally, over time, you get better at these things. But I started asking a lot of questions about, doing analysis. What are some tools? And again, coming from a financial background, obviously it's, people talk a lot about analysis there, and there's obviously a whole host of different almost kind of sects within that, or silos if you want. And, I always found that there's obviously a lot to be taken from it. And my initial introduction was through kind of macro investing. So obviously you have some great heroes and a lot of thinking, a lot of things you can absorb there. But I kind of said, I think there's a bit too much fluff here, perhaps. And one of the things that I was drawn to was intelligence analysis, as in what you would normally ascribe to things like how the CIA sit and analyze the world, or a similar outfit. And what I mean by this is really, it's more stripped down. Normally, you're looking at something that's much more flexible. You're trying to build some actual practical models, often without the need of all the kind of associated vocabularies that you may have in academia or that you have in finance, for sure. And you're trying to find these methods. So I started reading into this space, and again, we can share some links perhaps with your listeners, but there's some really good work done in that space that I found useful. And there's a gentleman called Hoyer, who's kind of, for me, a great inspiration, who kind of did a book on the space, and gives a lot of food for thought. There's some more practical stuff like the CIA's Tradecraft Primer on structured analytical techniques, where they use things like something I use a lot, which is like the devil's advocate, or devil's advocacy, which is basically you challenge a single strongly held view or consensus by building the best possible case for an alternative explanation. You can do things like blue-red teams, which is something I do with some of the institutional clients, where you build two opposite cases on key tenets of your thesis. And again, it's really about asking, what if we took the different view on things, and I think sometimes people, as you described a little bit in your introduction, people get very set in how they think about things, and they start owning a framework of understanding, and very rarely, once they bought into that and started to take ownership of it, it's very difficult to then take a step back and challenge it. And often when they are challenged by other people, it becomes a bit like a tribal contest between, I support this sports team, you support that sports team, and then people just kind of talk past each other. So those are some of my approaches into it. Again, you can go into, I think in the most latest reports, I use a gentleman called Margolis, who has done some really interesting frameworks on trigger analysis, and who does some thinking on instability and fragility of human societies. And again, there's some good frameworks for thinking. So that's kind of, I kind of try and source best ideas from different places, but where I found a lot of useful stuff that I use and I can kind of recommend people maybe look into for trying to make sense of the world around us, it's been in intelligence analysis.
I really love the way you explained all of that, and I wish I would get talk to more people like this, because this is exactly how we should be thinking, evaluating things piece by piece, and not falling into this label or category. Perhaps you can start us off looking at some trends, but I wanted to read again something from your publication, Around the World in 8 pages. You write that geopolitical cycles are slow-moving, revolutions happen fast but dawn slowly, and it appears that we have entered the dawn of a new era. International relations are in flux, diverse trends, technological, social, economic, are tearing at the fabric of individual societies and the overall framework of the collective global order of the last 70-plus years. So while the outcome is uncertain, it is clear that the status quo cannot hold, and you quote the Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci, "The crisis consists of precisely the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear." So, where would you like to start us off? What is most important for you to kind of describe what's happening right now?
Okay, I think just to bridge in from our last conversation, I think obviously we're talking about looking into the future, and that's obviously a difficult task. And I think, again, going back to some of my structures of analysis, you can think a little bit, this is quite a useful image that is used in other publications as well, which is you think about like a future as a cone. So you have what is very close and narrow to you, the probabilities of different outcomes. As we said, the geopolitics move pretty slowly, so there's not so many paths. But as we project further and further out, the cone expands, and the probable becomes a wider range of options. And obviously here, what I like to do, I used to think, when I tried to explain, my approach to work, I used to like to say, okay, it's kind of like a never-ending puzzle. And the more I thought about that, I thought that perhaps that's not the best way to describe it, because when you have a puzzle, you normally start with an image. So you already have an idea what you want the puzzle to look like because it's on the box. Then you go and try and find the pieces to match that image. And I don't think it's the right way to do it. I think obviously you got cognitive biases, and it's often where you come with a preset idea of what you're trying to see in the world, whatever specific nation or country or system you're looking at. So I prefer now, you cannot get rid of the cognitive biases, but what I try and do as a way to manage this is think of it more as you have multiple puzzles in front of you. All the pieces are kind of uniform in their shapes and coloring, and you're trying to basically fit these puzzles out. And obviously one puzzle may be a puzzle that leads to, let's say, China rising, taking over. It could be a puzzle that says, the US reinvents itself and runs for another 100 years. And you may have another puzzle that is, elegant decline of the US empire. And you're then looking for pieces when you sit and do your day-to-day analysis and looking at the different inputs. And you can then see which puzzle is filling up. It's kind of putting a framework to it, but also understanding that the framework can be a wider range of outcomes, and there's no real, way of knowing. There's no facts about the future. So that maybe is a long way to lead into then saying, okay, let's look at where we sit right now. And as you took it from my report, it's obviously pretty clear that what has been for the last 70 years, which by all means has been a very productive part of human history. What's been achieved economically, I think if you look at things like global poverty numbers, if you look at, all the key factors of kind of human endeavor, innovation has been at a very high level. So we achieved a lot, but there's obviously been some issues around the place, and we are starting to see some fragmentation of the order that kind of underpinned it all. Some of that is to do with obviously the US having had a very dominant and powerful position in this whole drive, and perhaps leveling out to a certain degree. And then you've had a natural kind of re-emergence of Asia and China at the center of that. And then you kind of have Europe sitting in the middle, who has perhaps been more and more in a retrenched position. Then you had this kind of European experiment of the European Union, which has been, 40 years and whatever in its evolution so far, with ups and downs and 2 steps forwards and 1 backwards. And you have some, parts like, let's say, Brazil in South America. You have had Africa going through quite a transformation as well, which is maybe not recognized as much. So you have all these different moving pieces within this larger framework. And I think it's pretty clear that what has been is not what we're leading into going forward. So then you can take each of those different regions and you can kind of sit and look at, what is essentially likely path forward. And I think, in the report, we start with North America, because obviously the US is the dominant nation in North America. But again, looking at geography, if you look at this perfect piece of real estate that is the North American landmass, you have this beautiful space which has, access to 2 big oceans, Europe on one side, Asia on the other, opening up for trade. You have this internal great farming center. You have rivers that flow the right ways. You have, Canada, which is pretty much, most of the population live like the US in cultural ways right next to the border. You have Mexico to the south, which again economically has been integrated a lot into that framework. And really, again, if you look at natural borders, the border doesn't really come from a security perspective, certainly until you kind of hit into the Colombian jungle. So, you have this whole reality. And I think if you look at that space, it obviously has all the ingredients for continued dominance, if you want, in global affairs. They've had 70 years of building a very diverse economy, some of the greatest companies in the world. Obviously, militarily, they're one nation or one entity that can really project power all around the world in a kind of sustained, so we say, strong format. So I think that's where we perhaps start. And then you can start saying, okay, what are some of the weaknesses to this? And one of the reports in the Around the World series, I did the devil's advocacy on the United States as what we call the cleanest shirt in the hamper, if you like, and try to challenge some of these things. Because again, obviously, if you're trying to look at change or trying to understand whether change is likely, sometimes it's best to take what is conceived as consensus and try and challenge it. So when you look at the US, obviously we just talked about the geography, and again, all these things are true and they don't obviously change much. But if you wanted to take the counter case of that, for example, you can say, okay, well, we are living in a more and more integrated world. All these great US companies are part of a global economy with a digital reality or digital framework being overlaid on the globe. The world has become much closer to each other. You have much more connectivity between individuals, between companies, businesses, and obviously nation states. Those moats of those two oceans on each side, they have become a lot smaller in the sense that you have much more ability to influence across the digital atmosphere. And on top of that, obviously, with transportation becoming much more useful. So you can challenge the geographic thing and saying, okay, well, we can actually reach into the United States. If you look at cyber conflict, if you look at information warfare, if you look at terrorism, all of these are ways that, maybe 100 years ago or 50 years ago, the US didn't really face these challenges. Whereas you can say this might be a challenge to the idea that geography, the US stands supreme. You can look at demographics, which is an area which, again, the US is, compared to Europe, compared to Japan, has much better in the traditional thinking of demographics, that you want to have a young, expanding population. They've been considered to be in an advantageous situation. You can look at that and say, okay, well, it's not maybe just about numbers. When we have a world which has become more digital, more automated, do you really want a lot of young people with maybe not the highest level of education? Or do you want maybe a slower growing population that is highly educated, that is healthy? And again, Japan might be an example, which is also something I've done one of the devil's advocacy exercises on in the past report, which is where we challenge the demographic aspect of it and say, well, maybe Japan's actually well positioned as opposed to being in structural decline, as many people think, if you look at demographics in the light of automation, in the light of digital reality. I think, again, there you can challenge whether the US demographically is actually in such a great position. You have a very one of the wealthiest generations of all time in history about to retire, and they obviously have some objectives that may not go hand in hand with the younger generation. So you have some divides there within the demographics. You have health issues. The US spends far more than any other nation or developed nation on healthcare, yet the outcomes, on whatever way you want to measure it, are not as good as you perhaps would expect for the money spent. So there's many things there you could challenge on demographics. The military, well, again, if you look at the traditional way of looking at military, they have, they're spending more than the 8, 9, 10 nations behind them. And they've been doing so for decades. So they have a huge advantage there. But again, you might say the stratagem has changed. Perhaps we're switching more to a hybrid style warfare, taking the sort of tenets of guerrilla warfare and using it more in a digital reality, which is something we can dig into a little bit further. Maybe that's alleviating some of the perceived strength of the US there. I think if you go at the economy, again, you can look at the debt factors, you can look at the deficits, you can look at these aspects. I think you look at financial markets, you can obviously look at the crisis in 2008 and kicking into the quantitative easing, and you can start raising some questions about, how much of this is real and how much of this is essentially magical financial tricks being played. But again, I think, my standpoint is that the US is in a unique position of leadership, but there are certainly areas where you can raise questions about whether that would be the case going forward.
Yeah, I've been reassessing my view of the U.S. Some of my guests, such as Morris Berman, who wrote the trilogy on the fall of the U.S. empire, and he's a hardcore declinist. And for a while, I used to have that idea that the U.S. is going to go into this decline, however long it takes into a severe decline. But I'm kind of thinking that that might not happen, that that they will lose some of their positioning, but they will remain strong. And then what I did want to ask you about is, well, Eurasia and this dragon bear. So I have the idea that the U.S. will continue to be strong, but that they're no longer the only one on the block, that we have this dragon bear rising that will reach the same status, if not a higher status, than the eagle, the U.S. And you recently had original analysis in your publication provided by Velina Chakarova, who is the head of the Austrian Institute for European Security Policy. And she has a really unique way of looking at this, and I like her visual kind of concept of this dragon bear and the eagle. And she's saying the world is becoming bipolar once again, dividing between the U.S. and this dragon bear, and that they're working to create these alternative Bretton Woods type structures. And so, what can you tell us about this Eurasian colossus that's emerging?
Well, number one, I would suggest that you try and see if Alina can find time to speak to you one day, because as you say, she's done great work on it. And, I've been trying to get her to do something for me for a while in writing, and finally she found time. So, but I can talk to it a little bit more broadly. And I think just to take a step back to the thing you said about the US again, there's this wonderful thing about the imminent versus the inevitable. And I think, it's very easy to sit and say, oh, well, look at the US debt and look at all empires always ends, and but is it imminent? How far away is it? Are we talking 10 years, 1 year, 100 years? And no one really knows. So again, you got to go back to look at things like the fragility of different systems. It's also comparative. So as you raise the Eurasian, the Chinese or Russian alliance, it has to be comparable to something, So I think one thing that is for sure, when we talked about the changes, I like this gentleman, or one of the big thinkers of real politics, if you like, Lord Palmerston of the English or the British Empire. He had the saying that nations, they have no permanent friends or allies. They have only permanent interests. And we have no eternal allies, and we have no perpetual enemies. Only our interests are eternal and perpetual, and these interests it is our duty to follow. So if you look at that, I think that's the climate we are into. And when you talk about the Russian-Chinese alliance, I think you're very much looking at that. I think they have a shared interest, and I think current policy from the US administration is perhaps forcing those interests to be even more expanded. Whether that's through kind of weaponizing the dollar, or whether it's through just playing hard-nosed politics with them, where perhaps it would be more interesting. Again, I think also with Europe, because if you look at Eurasia, obviously you got on one side, the Chinese kind of civilization that has been going from there. Then you had what is traditionally the Russian sphere of influence across the middle of the whole place. And then to the west, you have obviously this European labor formation that has been in, whether it's kind of the Hanseatic League or whether it's now the European Union. But you have these different interests. And, you have Mackinder, who's obviously talked about this kind of heartland theory. And I think, the traditional, shall we say, idea is that you keep Eurasia divided, and then because that would be perhaps the super piece of real estate that could compare to the North American entity. Again, it's a much larger and much more contrastful natural environment. And again, full of causes for concern. If you look at the empire, sort of the graveyard of empires in the middle, and obviously, China and Russia are traditionally, so we say, in alliance, and obviously Europe has always kind of struggled within itself, and perhaps pushing towards Russia in latter years, in my lifetime at least. So, what we're seeing right now is perhaps more this thing about, if the US is more dominant role as the global policeman, if you want, which was kind of a traditional Washington consensus idea, where Europe is now sitting, perhaps asking some questions. Europe is obviously integrated to some degree because, for example, Russia is both European and Asian in nature. There's a lot of natural gas flowing from Russia into Europe. There's a lot of trade coming out of Germany towards Asia, Russia. So there's an interlink already there. But on the security matters, it has always been the US and Europe together. If that's coming up for questioning to a certain degree, then obviously that opens up some doors for this Eurasian reality. And as we just talked about, China and Russia has come to a lot of agreements. It seems that China is allowed to move economically into Kazakhstan, into these major countries in the middle, and obviously into Russia, specifically the Asian part of Russia, where you're seeing development of natural gas, oil directly into China. And obviously also China has a stated interest in becoming more and more involved in the Arctic, which is where Russia obviously again has the real estate, if you like. So there is a lot of synergies, if you like, between these two places. And they're kind of being pushed together by external forces, mainly the US targeting them for various reasons. So again, you can talk about Eurasia rising, or you can talk about Eurasia becoming more fluid. So if you look at from the kind of European side, the question is, if you go 10, 20 years down the line, will the European Union become some kind of more stable unit that's still linked security-wise to North America? Or will it start to be diverting interest within that kind of leads to its slow erosion, and perhaps someone more part of, let's say, Eastern Europe or some key countries in Europe start leaning more towards the Eurasian reality, and engaging with China economically, maybe Russia for energy? Do we have a more fluid situation where Europe starts to disappear into a Eurasian reality, whereas for the last 40, 50 years, Western Europe has been kind of a hallmark of kind of a Western North American Atlantic reality? And again, you then got to look at things like China. Obviously, a lot is to do with whether they can find their way on this very ambitious course that they've set out, and whether they really have much choice. And again, there you can look at some things around leadership, centralized leadership, and the fragility that brings, and even more so in Russia, where you obviously have more rule by man than by law. And that comes with, again, if you look at history, you have these kind of mad, bad emperor dynamics, which, once you have rule by man, if that man or his leadership groups disappears, then suddenly you have a big vacuum, and that normally can lead to chaos. And again, if you look at both China and Russia, it is, in the long sweeps of history, places that go through incredible development and then normally some implosion into chaos for a couple of 100 years before it's then put back together, and then we have another run at it. So whatever the path leads in that direction, it's hard to deny right now that there is a lot of fundamentally systemic developments in the heartland of Eurasia between China and Russia that is driving maybe towards something more constructive. I think that one of the key questions becomes how Europe ends up playing into this. And again, obviously, whether China and Russia can navigate the different obstacles ahead of them, some internal and some perhaps being put in their way externally.
I'd like to get your thoughts on warfare and conflict, because there's talk today of this Thucydides trap, where empires, this historical cycle where empires decline and then new empires rise. And there's a lot of this hyped up talk. I think some of it's to get clickbait, about World War III or thermonuclear war, which I think is possible. I mean, if we look at these things realistically, like, I'm here in the former Soviet Union, and everyone here tells me nobody could have imagined when that day came in 1990, 91, when it collapsed. No one imagined that. Or when war broke out in my country, Croatia and Yugoslavia. Again, like, no one, it just happens out of the blue. Same thing with the world wars. So I think it's a possibility, but I don't think in the near term that's something that we'll be looking at. And something that you mentioned was this aspect of cyber warfare, information warfare, hybrid warfare. To me, this seems like this is going to be where all the action is going to be at. What are your thoughts on, as we shift into this new order that's being built and the old one that's being deconstructed? What are your thoughts on the trends of warfare and conflict?
Yeah, I think you raised some good points there. I mean, again, going back to a little bit the kind of futures cone or the funnel, change is not an event, it is the process. And again, when you're sitting monitoring, you're looking for those pieces of the process to come in place. So when you say, World War III and nuclear war, these things are possible, but very unlikely. And I don't think we're around them. And I think there's also a tendency either for, as you say, clickbait, just like if you go on Twitter for 5 minutes, okay, is that people like to jump to the conclusion of any theory that they have. So then it's always the extreme. One has to be this or it has to be that. Most times in human systems or human complexities, we end up somewhere in a more nuanced, gray-centric kind of path of development. Again, if you want to try and take the different possible outcomes, I think obviously you can look at maybe in regards to the US as a leadership, you could look at either reinvention of the US, which they have a history of doing. I mean, it's only a couple of 100 years, but they have a history of reinvention, and perhaps they could build the foundations for another century under the kind of American leadership. Maybe that would go in some combination with China hitting some trouble. You could have like the UK to US transition, what we call an elegant decline, where perhaps we, in all the different frameworks, the US retrenches out of Asia slowly, militarily. Maybe the dollar takes a slow grind into something different where it still remain very powerful in parts, but China slowly shifts to buying its commodities in its own currencies, being able to do trade in the Eurasian landmass and in currencies local to those places. And you can take each of these different veins of power and say, okay, we do a slow retrenchment, a bit like what happened to the UK handing over to the US, where we go through a 20-30 year period without any sort of really hot conflict. Then you can have a more dramatic scenario where you either have push come to shove, Chinese, Russian influence hitting into the US somewhere. You have maybe some mistakes made at a local level, whether that's in the South China Sea, or whether that's in places like Korea or other parts where we have flashing of kind of all these dynamics. The tinder that has been building up suddenly gets lit. Like if you go back in the 1930s and look at how the start of the First World War, for example, you could have a scenario where the US, collapses from within, in the sense that there's major internal issues in the US divides between generations, divides between the over inequality. The politics is obviously very partisan right now, I should say. And, you could have some kind of deterioration from within that would then lead to a big vacuum in the world. So I think these are different possibilities. And one area to look at, where again, if you go back to looking at challenging consensus, one area I've been spending a lot of time on, both from the investment aspect, is technology and this aspect of the leaps in innovation that we see, and how technology can be a multiplier. So it has been for the US. They've been out ahead of everyone, and they kind of given them a runway to get well ahead of most others, whether it's economically or militarily. But it's also a way to leapfrog. And obviously there's a lot of focus right now on stolen IP and people catching up. And again, this is quite normal in history between dominant parts of the world, where they get ahead from technology or innovation, and then other people catches up by to be fair, stealing or taking and improving upon models from success stories around the world. So one of the areas I've been looking a lot at is technology. And then again, if you're looking at geopolitics and you're looking at military, you kind of start seeing that there's some areas here that if you were the protagonist, if you were sitting in the seat of being a strategist out of, let's say, China or Russia, and you're faced with this dominant, kinetic, traditional military of the US, and you would say, okay, we can try and match them and go out into open sea and then meet them out there. And, most likely we would all be sunk, and we would have wasted, we would be getting into this kind of Cold War scenario where we're spending billions and billions of dollars on trying to catch up, and most likely we would not really be able to win such a confrontation. So unlikely that they would choose that road. So then what are the other possibilities? So then you look at things like the hybrid warfare, and that's where I've seen a lot of traction. I think it's very interesting when you look at it. So I spend a lot of time reading, for example, a lot of US government documents, internal documents from various agencies that are accessing right now their military capabilities in consideration to cyber, for example, or information warfare. And one of the things that stands out to me is that there's a lot of reactionary language. So there's a lot of we must do, we will, we must move away from, which is interesting considering that this is a force, as we can observe before, that has spent a lot of money, a lot of money over decades, and they're looking at these weapon systems now, where perhaps in a conventional sense they are so dominant that they can't really be challenged. But if you start thinking unconventionally about where's the weakness in this, is perhaps in the fact that, even if you look at there's a number of reports out, but there's a Gao report which looks at weapon systems. It's called the DoD, just beginning to grapple with scale of vulnerabilities from 2018. And some of the things they highlight, is that when you have all the weapon system functioning by computer, for basic operational aspects, then you have a weakness, specifically now that we know and can see that cyber, for example, is more and more of an avenue that is being pursued, and where we are having more of a leveling of skills, as in that Russia and China is perfectly capable. The US, as far as I can understand it, is still very dominant, certainly in the offensive side of use of cyber. But again, it is a leveler. So, it leads you to asking questions about the traditional way of thinking about U.S. military power. And again, there's some of this is natural. You build this huge machine and it moves slowly in terms of change, and the world is changing. It's been fighting in terrorist warfares in the kind of Middle East and smaller nation states warfare for, the last 40 years. And now we're seeing a changing perhaps of that. So there's a change in that. There's a change to technology. And there's a lot of cost involved. Again, there's this thing when you are a huge entity like the US military and you have very deep pockets, everything you try and do costs a lot more money than maybe it does in other places. And everything you try and do will take a long time before it can really truly be implemented. So if you look at the sort of cyber aspect of it, it raises basic questions. If with cyber, you can basically circumvent this traditional sense of military strength by basically saying, okay, well, you have this $100 million fighter plane, but how much is it really worth if an adversary can sit undetected far away and simply just switch off the oxygen? Or if you have a $15 billion aircraft carrier, but with use of, let's say, electric warfare or cyber warfare, you can make it so it can't really communicate with its aircraft, or it doesn't really know where it is because it's relying on sat-nav, which can be interfered with. What about smart kinetic weapons, $100 million rockets? If you're using, left of target tools, which is kind of a way to, again, interfere with the data input and the communications of these smart weapons, for example, then suddenly you have this great leveler effect, and then you have to ask questions about what is preconceived in terms of military strength, for example.
Yeah, I think these are timeless principles, and it reminds me a bit of David and Goliath as well. I think Michael Pillsbury wrote the book, The 100-Year Marathon, where he talks about how the Chinese are now focusing on this, finding the weakest points through unconventional warfare. And yeah, instead of spending, it doesn't make sense to spend that money to match the US. I wanted to talk a bit, switch now gears to the macro economy. And you're also an advisory board member of the BFI Capital Group. And in the Around the World in 8 pages that you sent me, you had someone writing about the U.S. economy again, the Federal Reserve, and basically them saying that the Fed isn't as all powerful as many people think, and that the U.S. still has room to kick the can down the road, so that I guess in the near term again that we're okay. And so what are your thoughts on the global macroeconomic situation and what troubled waters lie ahead?
Well, I mean, I think, again, if you take a step back to, let's say, 2008, 10 years ago, it's a decade ago, where we see this financial world, I think some of the key takeaways from it is perhaps that human economic system is a human system, and we seem to be able to change the goalposts quite a lot and the rules around it when it suits us, or suits certainly a majority of either the people who control it, and generally most people in the population are quite happy to follow along if it means they're not being dropped off into some chaotic new reality. So what does that mean? It means that, we can, as you say, extend things. We can change the rules of things. I don't really see, I think when we talked about all these different geopolitical aspects, I think one of the things that has obviously been relatively lacking, if you look at the price levels or the indices, pretty much wherever you want to look, but specifically US, they're very advanced. And if you just talked about all these different issues geopolitically and all this change, it doesn't really seem to be reflecting into financial markets at this stage. So I think economically, you can very clearly see that what is underway right now, which is perhaps a reversal to some degree of globalization, going from a global economy, outsized manufacturing, global companies reaching further and further afield for markets. Perhaps we are going into a different direction where it's more regional, where there is a lot to be redrawn in terms of how things work in terms of agreements, and this will take time. So economically, you can see Asia slowing down. You can watch whatever you want. I would suggest get beyond the GDP figures and just start looking at actual manufacturing, electrical inputs, freight of either seaborne or by air. You can look at all these different levels, and you can see that the global economy is slowing down to a degree. Whether that continues to escalate time will tell. But again, this is not really priced into most equity markets either. So you have this split between the two. And I think there's one thing that we talk a lot about in the financial space is this fact that global financial markets have been sort of drifting around this QE days for a while. There's been a lot of innovation, a lot of good things going on as well. But they're completely been separated from all these major changes in the geopolitical space. And perhaps what we'll do at some stage is kind of geopolitics coming in and smacking this financial drift right in the mouth and saying, okay, here's some realities. Now we have to try and price these factors in. I mean, again, it's quite interesting. One of the things that got me into looking at the cyber security sector initially, for example, was that, I started looking at this digital aspect of the world, and I was interested in kind of a picks and shovel place on the fact that the world is getting more and more digital, more and more of our data is digital, more and more of our business projects are in digital format. Obviously, financial markets are digital. So I started thinking about this, and I started asking questions about this whole concept of the fact that we moved in this direction. So I came across this quote, which is an agency that does a lot of work on the space, and they basically highlighted that in 2015, 84% of the value of an S&P 500 company was in intangible assets, whereas in 1975, 16% or 15% was in intangible asset, meaning that most of the valuations of these giant global companies was in fact derived from intangible assets, IP, data, proprietary systems, and what have you. Most of this, again, is in digital format, as has been well documented. Some of this IP gets stolen, again, via cyber, for example. But I don't really think that gets factored in. So my next question was then, how is all this protected if you have all these huge companies with all this value at risk, really sitting in a digital kind of castle in the clouds, if you like, or in the cloud computing? How is this really protected? And again, I did some deep dives with some specialists in the area, and again, the answers that came up were not particularly reassuring. So again, if you apply that across that scenario, you mix that in with the geopolitical reality, you're looking at this retrench of globalization, which again, if you look at any change, is always worth looking at who's the biggest beneficiary of what went before. And again, you can look at individual nations like, let's say, South Korea or Germany, who's exporting. You can look at big US and European companies who are outsourcing manufacturing, trading globally, and pretty much kind of, you may say that they're a European or German company or they're an American company, but they're really global companies, and they have shareholders they respond to more than any given nation state. So if we have this major change, they are probably the biggest losers in this. And again, this is not reflected in share prices. And you have all these, let's say, risk building up in the system that are not just economic, but actually goes into the geopolitical arena. So again, if we go back to just look at the cybersecurity aspect, one of the things about cyber warfare is that it's asymmetric in nature. If you switch off the electricity grid in the eastern seaboard of the United States of America, you have a global crisis on your hand. You have financial markets down. You have all-out panic. If you then try and go back and hit Moscow and switch their light off, it's just a bad day in Moscow. Okay, it's not a huge issue. It's a regional, local issue. So you have this kind of, you can punch much heavier the other way. And again, when you look at things like security measures, you're relying on private individual businesses, whether they are banks or financial companies or whether they're infrastructure providers to do their own security. It's not necessarily the US government, who has amazing tools at their disposal, but they're not sitting protecting Citibank's security. Or their natural grid security to a certain degree. So you have this asymmetric issue. And again, this is not priced in any way or form. So when you're looking at the macro issues, I think you could go beyond just figuring out, is this market here, but we have more QE. Will the Federal Reserve be able to boost the market higher? Or, can we get more stimulus? Can government come together and find infrastructure plans? All these things, they will happen or they will not happen. But I think there's a lot larger dynamics at play that is worth thinking about.
Recently, I interviewed famed investor Jim Rogers, who had started the Quantum Fund with George Soros some decades ago. And I kind of the interview turned out to be a bit of a clickbait, but that wasn't my intention. And I got a lot of listens. But I enjoy Jim Rogers. I've read his books. But he said that again. He said something that in he gave a time frame that in 1 or 2 years, the system will collapse, and he makes the case that all the fundamentals are there, that things are fundamentally wrong, but they keep kicking the can down the road, and nobody knows when things are come to a head. But he's been saying this. He said the coming financial collapse will be the worst in his lifetime. But he's been saying, a lot of commentators have been comments on the interview said that he's been saying this for like 10 years, 10, 20, years. And so nothing's happened. So, I mean, what are your thoughts? I mean, is there going to be some collapse, or will things just things are more nuanced, as you say, things will just, there's more resilience and adaptability built into the system?
I think so. I mean, I like Tim Rogers as well, listening to him, and obviously he's a guy who knows how to get some self-promotion out there, and I don't knock that at all. But I always, when you have people expressing certainty about complex issues, it's always a bit of an alarm for me. Okay, and obviously I understand that the framework of modern media is all about, here's my take and here's an opposing take, and let's have an argument about it, and that goes into social media. But I always, when I see, I come from a financial background, I've seen plenty of sales pitches, and when someone can have absolute certainty in something that you cannot be certain about, that's always a time to leave the room. Okay, and again, I find that translates very well into the matters of geopolitics or more complex human systems. So, not to knock Mr. Rogers, I find it very hard to understand how you can put a time period on something that you can't really fully understand all the different there's so many different moving parts of that. So how can you put a timeline on it like that? Again, I agree that there's certainly a lot of fire that can be caught, or overlay of risk around the world in all these different frameworks, some of it we touched upon today, but I also think that there is a counter to that, and one is that most days the world doesn't end. Okay, number one. So that's your base rule. Number two, humans have a way of finding a way through these things. We have done terrible, terrible things. I mean, I'm from Europe, so Europe is a place of obviously magnificent achievements, but also one of incredible warfare and devastation. And we find our way through these things. And I think, again, you're looking forward out there. Most people beyond small geopolitical circles, or guys hanging out on Twitter, or people in the financial world, most people they just want to get up, be with their family, go out and start their business, work in their business, go into work in their job, and that's kind of what they're about. Okay, they want to have a better day tomorrow than they had today, and they're quite happy to sign on for anything that kind of prolongs that. Okay, so again, there is a feeling where people who may have put a bet on sort of a chaos tomorrow, whether it's in the gold space or whether it's in other parts of it, they want almost to see this chaos, and they're starting to try and look for reasons why this chaos is just about to happen. And again, I would say that while many of those reasons are true, it's also true that the majority of people at all levels don't want to see that chaos. And that is very powerful. I think 2008, 2009 is an example of that. Whereas we would all sit there and, I sat there and watched and thought, wow, the whole thing is going to collapse. US banks are being closed down every Friday. I was in Cape Town at the time, and I would be sitting there on Saturday morning. I would get up and I would be looking at the FIDIC documents coming out saying, this bank has been taken over and this bank is now closed. And you thought, wow, every weekend there's another 20, 30, regional banks being closed and rolled up. And, really people were thinking that, and you thought Wall Street, they're to blame, and, they're all going to go to prison. And there was all this kind of drive. But reality was that, we had a couple of years, we had a lot of liquidity pumped into the system, and certainly not sustainable if you're looking at it in traditional mathematical terms. But, we've had 10 years of pretty much growth on the back of that. So again, whether that can be sustained, probably not. There will be issues around in regional areas. But again, if you're looking at the long thread or the long arcs of history, I think we'll probably be okay. I think we will have changes. I think there'll be changes globally. I think you will have a more regional reality, perhaps, than you've had before. I think globalization will take a stop and have a look at it. There's some internal issues to be addressed. Again, I'm not much for politics besides just observing it. But, people talk about all this populism and all these problems, and about how it's China's fault, or it's Europe's fault, or it's Germany's fault, or it's Greece's fault, or Italy. The problems are normally more localized in the issue. If you look at the last 70 years, to go back where we kind of started, I think we've gone from a global economy of like $1 or $2 trillion to one of around 70. So people will talk about inflation and what have you, but there's no real denying that the pie has gotten a lot bigger. We can talk about how we're going to become more productive, whether that's in agriculture, whether that's in various levels of business. So the pie has become more tasty, if you like. The pie has maybe not been split very equally, and inequality is an issue. But again, these are normally regional, national issues more than they are one where you point fingers at strangers as the first way. We might have to look in the mirror in different parts of the world and say, what changes can we actually make to make it more equitable, while not losing this drive for constant pursuit of a better way to do things, and rewarding the people who do find those solutions. So it's a complex issue, but that is basically human progress.
I think you wound down the conversation well, and that's a great place to leave it. And you leave us with optimism, which is good. I feel optimistic.
I have 3 young kids, so obviously, there's this saying that obviously from what we do, you want to be, you don't get really paid to be a pessimist or an optimist. You get paid to be a realist. And obviously sometimes that can be a pretty dark place to sit and look at things. But I have my 3 wonderful kids, and every day you go out and you look at them and you think, obviously, there must be a better way forward. And, I speak to many people, and if you just run by the headlines, it can be a very negative world. But once I get out traveling and I meet people in all walks of life, they're normally in the same kind of situation as me. They all kind of want to make improvements. They want changes where there's real problems. But I think the majority of people, of humanity, they're trying to push forward in a more positive way, and that's something to carry with you. It doesn't mean there can't be issues. It doesn't mean there can't be accidents, and that's what we got to watch for. I think we're heading into times of change, and I think to kind of leave it all off, you can take Mr. Eric Hoffer's quote that in times of change, they learners, they inherit the world, while the learned, they find themselves beautifully equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists. So, I encourage people to stay curious and keep learning. And I think we need to think maybe a bit bigger instead of getting very focused on blaming others for issues that maybe we can be part of a solution for.
All right. And finally, can you tell us about your websites and services, and how people can get around the world, and how listeners can find you?
Yeah, so I work mainly with accredited investors, so that has to be clear in terms of advisory side of the business. But on the back of that, I've always wanted to have some of my research public, because I like the feedback. I like to hear from people from different parts of the world and different walks of life. So we do issue the Around the World, which is a quarterly publication focused on geopolitics, macroeconomics, basically what we talked about today. Which is publicly available. People can go onto our website under the research part and request it. They can contact me on Twitter, where I'm pretty active, Librarium Views. And we also have a report series called 8 Pages About, which is more thematic, focusing on areas that I find interesting, which could be, let's say, investing in innovation. It can be about agriculture. We've done a report on not so long ago. So it's more investment orientated and more specific and irregular in format. But those 2 reports are publicly available to all. And as I said, I like conversation, so people should feel free to reach out. I like feedback.
I would recommend people check it out, because you really have a different view from the usual stuff. I think people will enjoy that. So that's at librariuminsights.com, and your Twitter is at librariumviews. So thanks again for the interview.
It's been great. Hope to speak to you again in the future, and all the best with everything.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast and interview. I would like to remind you that our website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and you can sign up for our mailing list that goes out each weekend with the latest podcast and a long collection of important news headlines. It's good to sign up for the newsletter in case we experience censorship and deplatforming. You can help the Geopolitics and Empire podcast by subscribing to and interacting with all of our channels, such as YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Gab, Minds, and Steemit. You can also help us by leaving a rating and review on your favorite podcast platform, such as iTunes, Castbox, Stitcher, Spreaker, and so on. Finally, if you value our work and our mission and would like to see us continue interviewing experts from across the political spectrum, please consider leaving a one-time donation via PayPal or Bitcoin, or becoming a regular monthly supporter on our Patreon. All the links can be found on geopoliticsandempire.com. Thanks for listening.